From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout, this is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. And today I have a special guest that was referred to me by a colleague saying that he would be a great person to speak to, a great person for me to learn from. So I'm pleased to introduce you to Rohan Thompson. And Rohan, can you introduce yourself to the listeners? Tell them a little bit about your journey so far.
Yeah, so thank you, Marianne. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be part of an important conversation. So Rohan Thompson, a little bit about myself, first generation Canadian. My parents immigrated to Canada in the early 70s from Jamaica. Grew up in the GTA. But I think more of importance is I went to university. I did my undergrad and my master's in Waterloo region, and ended up staying out there to work. And so I was working at the municipal level, the local municipality or the lower tier municipality, City of Kitchener, and also with the region of Waterloo. And so with the City of Kitchener, I was doing a lot of community building, community development, capacity building, neighborhood programs, that sort of stuff. And then I moved on to the region, did again, community building, capacity building, but really policy analysis, right? And policy development over with a small unit called the Crime Prevention Council. And so they were looking at the social determinants of crime. So how do we address the root causes so folks don't get involved? And then, after, a stint with those folks, then I came and worked for a board of education. So I was with the board of education for a period of time. So their workplace equity manager and their assistant director of equity. So I was with them a while. And then now I'm the director of people and equity with the County of Dufferin. In addition to that, I do run my own private practice. I'm a licensed practicing clinician. And so I do a lot of one-on-one groups, couples counseling around a variety of issues. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell, and with a significant focus around addressing structural racism, anti-Blackness, systemic oppression, and its impact of folks in the workplace, their mental health, and their daily lives.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into all of that. But because this is a Psych Health and Safety podcast, I got to ask you, when did you first hear that term, psych health and safety, psychological health and safety?
Yeah, psychological health and safety really sort of came on my radar. I want to start saying maybe around 2018, 2019. That's when the verbiage sort of showed up on my radar. I might be late to the dance, right? But that's around the time when I really started to hear it show up in the workplace. And again, a lot of it was in relation to having conversations and discussions about systemic racism and structural racism and the types of discrimination that folks were experiencing, and how do we create the space, a psychologically safe space, so that the conversations can even take place in the first place.
Yeah, and I love that you really have gone from and stay from the micro to the macro, right? From the dealing with individuals and the impact on them, all the way to policy and structural issues. And so I'm looking forward to what you have to share around that. When we talk psychological health and safety, everything that you do becomes part of it, right? Every aspect of it.
Absolutely.
Let's start at the macro, though, because you help organizations in your consulting business. You help organizations who, the way that you say it is to help them improve their organizational culture. Yeah. So can you share a few ideas for what you think needs to happen to improve organizational culture, especially as it pertains to racism?
Yeah, absolutely. So So there are a couple of things that I think need to happen. First and foremost, there's an understanding that it's a structural problem. Right? So often, the conversations are like, well, that's not who we really are. We just have some bad apples, right? And really taking a sort of myopic view of how racism and discrimination and anti-Blackness and such show up in the workplace, right? And yes, we have interpersonal, but we also have structural racism as well. We have structural oppression. So the first understanding is that the issue is structural, and because it's structural, and systemic, we need a structural and systemic response, right? Yeah. So number one. Number two is the acknowledgement that yes, we actually do have this problem. Like, it does exist. It's not something that happens in other places, but not here, because we all hold hands and we eat lunch together, and we sing hymns, and and we have potlucks, and no, you actually do have the problem in your organization, because again, we understand it's systemic, so it's everywhere, right? And after we sort of have some of those that understanding from the leadership all the way through, there needs to be some significant capacity building and understanding around what the issues are, what they look like, what is required of people and organizations in order to interrupt and disrupt this. And then we need to be able to do a level of analysis to see where we're at as an organization, and then put the plan in place to address these things that we've identified, and be able to evaluate and monitor and report back on how we're doing in regards to implementing the plan, and more importantly, what's the impact that this implementation is having, if any, right? So these are just some of the key building blocks that, from my experience and in my professional life, both hats, that I really encourage and organizations need to go in that direction to really have a chance.
And that Plan, Do, Check, Act model, it's the foundation of the national standard on psych health and safety. But Rohan, can you share with us some of the stories about what the blind spots are? Because we know that a lot of organizations are dealing with what we call white fragility, where we want to say, no, we're good people, we would never do that. And because we're so busy defending ourselves, we can't see what's actually happening. Help us understand some of these things that are systemic.
Yeah. So, so one story I'll share with you to just give an example is, so I was working with an organization, and they were tasked to create a strategy, in particular to address anti-Black racism. So that was the mission, right? And when we had the senior leaders around the table to sort of start to figure out, how do we do this? How do we get started? What are the resources that are required? Et cetera, et cetera. There was this idea, this notion that kept, coming up around the table from the senior leaders around, but do we really need this? This isn't really a problem here. If the issue is that, people don't understand the policies and procedures that we already have in place. We don't need new policies. We don't need a new strategy. We don't need a new program. So right off the bat, there is this being very dismissive and denial of something that exists, that has already, in this particular organization, has been measured, it has been clearly communicated. And so now our job as staff is to respond to this. But here we have senior leaders who are actually demonstrating resistance and wanting to stop the work. So it then requires people to do the thing that is so uncomfortable, but is necessary. It's to actually push back against the resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And that's tough when the resistance is the boss, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. But if we clearly have a mandate, right? Like when we have a mandate from the organization that says we are doing this, then we're doing that thing. And it requires a level of courage and fortitude for people to hold the organization accountable to doing that thing, right? One of the bits that came up in the conversation, it happens all the time, sometimes we call it the whatabouts, right? And they say, well, and it's a strategy to get away from talking about racism or anti-Blackness or anti-indigeneity or what may have you. It's like, well, what about the LGBTQ community? What about the Muslim community? What about fill in the blanks? Mm-hmm. Right? As a way to disregard, it's a detour to get away from the conversation of racism. And so, you have to, it's a very nuanced strategy, and you have to be able to pick up on it and to be able to interrupt it in the moment, right? And so when we think about, the numerous variables out there that impact people experiencing differential treatment in spaces, right?
Yeah.
So, whether that be age, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and the list goes on and on. The one variable across all sectors that tends to be the biggest descriptor of differential treatment is race, right? Not saying that other variables don't describe differential treatment and differential experiences. Race tends to be the biggest descriptor. So we're always going to have the conversation about race. So if we're talking about homophobia, right? Yeah, we can have the conversation about homophobia. Let's talk about the experience of Black queer people too, can we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been an excuse for a while. That, we can't start here because then, as you call it, the whatabouts. Mm-hmm. But what I've found in the work that we've been doing around inclusion is start anywhere. Start where you've already measured, start where there's an issue. And because when you improve in one area, it actually lifts everybody else up. That if we are inclusive, and we deal with the issues that have been identified, it will benefit everyone.
Yeah, I correct. But what I would add to that is, in our attempt to be inclusive is to then run away from the conversation of race and racism, then we're not being inclusive.
Yeah, Maureen Shaw said to us once, sometimes you have to highlight a particular issue before you can integrate it into a bigger approach, because people don't get it, right? They just don't understand it. And that's really where we want to go, is to help people to understand the experience.
And so, like, even when I think about this period of time that we're in right now, right? At no point in time has equity been a bigger conversation. Right? At no point in time has inclusion been such a big conversation. Companies are throwing money at it. There's director of equity roles. There's, every other day, there's a new manager of equity roles showing up someplace. Like it is unprecedented, right? We have all kinds of initiative. We have, so it's a moment in time, right, where equity gets to be on the forefront, right? But, it's really important to sort of understand how we got here, right? Like what really pushed us over the hump, right? And we saw a worldwide mobilization, to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor, to Ahmaud Arbery, right? Really these most grotesque examples of anti-Blackness, right? And so it's disingenuous, in my perspective, when we're talking about, psychological safety, mental health and well-being, all those, things that impact the workplace and impact individuals in the workplace. If then we're going to then use, because of these things that have happened, this catalyst, but we're going to be intentional and not talk about race. Like, it's so disingenuous, it's gross. So,
and that's just the fear, right? It's fear. And when we can talk about these things, we can address them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And that's just where I come from.
Yeah, we did some national surveying
Mm-hmm.
about psychological health and safety, and
Mm-hmm.
we broke it down.
Yeah.
So by different groups.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when we looked at people who identified as Black Canadians,
Mm-hmm.
we found that their overall score of psychological health and safety in the workplace
Mm-hmm.
was higher than the average.
Mm-hmm.
So you think, oh, well, they're doing all right. But when you break it down into areas of feeling trusted, feeling that you're not discriminated against, what some people have suggested is that many racialized groups do try to be more positive, and so their scores may be higher. But when you look at the actual statements, you see where the disparity is. You see where the lack of equity actually exists. And so it was a real eye-opener to any organization that does an employee survey and lumps everyone together may think it's all fine. You know, majority of our people are fine. But what if you only have a couple people from a particular group? Their numbers aren't going to have a significant difference. So what's your advice in those cases?
Yeah, so you bring up a really, really great example. And so let's sort of tease out the bits on that a little bit. So first and foremost, you know, when you're collecting information, right, it's so important that we collect disaggregated data, right? So that it's not just, you know, everybody gets lumped in a pile, because we're all not the same. And so in a workplace, let's just say there's 100 people in the workplace, and 10 of the folks in the workplace identify as Black or racialized, and they're having a differential experience. Well, it's going to get washed out, right? But if we're collecting disaggregated data, we'll say, okay, well, here's the overall picture, but then here's what it's broken down into categories, into different groups. And so when we're talking about equity, it's not about treating everybody the same. It's about giving people or treating people the way that they need to be treated, all dependent upon their needs, right? So I think, you know, your example is great. And what I would say to that is, when we're doing any sort of data collection and organization, we have to talk about and we have to collect disaggregated data. That's how we're going to know who's having differential experiences, right?
Right. The challenge is that the researchers who create a lot of these surveys, in order to protect confidentiality, say that if there's less than 10 people in a group, you won't get the results. And so it becomes a challenge for organizations that are not that diverse. How do they do it? I mean, our approach to it now is to just say, are you in a racialized group? So that it's not all separated out, but in larger groups, you can do it more. But yeah, it's quite illuminating.
Yeah.
When you're working with individuals and you're talking to them about the trauma of racism, what's your advice to somebody who's in a workplace where there is that subtle microaggressions, that implicit bias, but they don't feel empowered to speak up?
Yeah. Well, first thing is some education. So first thing is I don't make any assumptions, right? And so there's an assumption that, you know, if you're a racialized person, if you're a Black person, if you're an Indigenous person, that just because of your identity, you understand exactly how oppression, racism, anti-indigeneity is operating around you and impacting you. So in my private practice, I never make that assumption, right? And so often, you know, people are surviving this thing, but they haven't really studied it or examined it. So they actually don't know how it's operating sort of on a, you know, at the front part of their brain, right? They may understand intuitively, but to be able to actually put language around it and examine it. So in my sessions, you know, I do a lot of work with folks to help them sort of understand, you know, how anti-Blackness or how racism is operating around them, and the impacts that is actually having on them. And some of the ideas or the ideologies that we buy into that actually contribute to us having lower levels of mental health and well-being. So let me give you an example, right? So, one of the overriding sort of ideas or ideologies that we buy into in North America is this idea of meritocracy, right? And so, the cream will rise to the top, right? Work hard, study, make the right sacrifices, and you should have a level of success, right? However, in the workplace, the research doesn't bear that to be true, right? There's a study that I reference, and there's a whole bunch of research studies to reference, but there's one that was replicated in Toronto. It's done worldwide, but it was replicated in Toronto, and it had an interesting twist to it, and it's the resume experiment, right? So where you look at the names on the resume, they get submitted, and you look at who gets callbacks. You have Black sounding names, you have white sounding names, right? The piece that made this one interesting is there was, all things being equal, you had Black sounding names, you had white sounding names, you had white sounding names with criminalities, you had Black sounding names with criminalities. And it looked at the rate of callbacks that people received. And so the study showed that, in number one position were white sounding names getting callbacks, right? The number two position was white sounding names with criminalities. The third position was Black sounding names, no criminalities, right? So it's really to help people disrupt this myth of meritocracy, because if people buy into it hook, line, and sinker, then they will end up blaming themselves for the lack of success that they're having and not actually realize what they're up against is systemic racism. Yeah. Right? So it's really to help people understand, like, this idea, this piece around meritocracy, it's a fallacy, right? And there are numerous research reports around how Black folks are discriminated in the hiring process, right? So I really go to help people understand those things, right? Number two is people often will try to explain things away, right? Well, this person, it's an individual. This person, it's a one-off experience. This over here is a one-off experience. Yeah, like if you look at it as a one-off, right, it'll be a one-off, but look at it as the collection. You just told me six different experiences, right? Like that looks like a pattern to me, right? So it's to try to help people sort of connect the dots a bit, right? And really also help people to understand, the impact. And what I mean, around impact is how first, what is racial trauma, right? And so, because racism is violence, it is psychological violence, right? It causes harm, right? There's a social worker, and his quote is something to the effect of, it is like a laceration to the soul, right? And so, Kenneth Hardy is the social worker. So racial trauma is experiencing symptoms of anxiety, hypervigilance to threat, a lack of hopelessness for the future because of, which is the result of sort of, related or repeated exposure to racism and discrimination, right? Like this is how people are traumatized by racism. And then so what are the ways in which that racial trauma shows up in people? And so I try to help folks sort of understand a bit better what that is. And so, the three kind of really big things is this perception of a lack of control, right? This is kind of like the impact on people. I have no control over anything, right? There is this internalization, right? And I sort of spoke to it, is that, they're the reason for the problem, right? There are these racist tropes these ideologies that society sort of attaches to racialized bodies, to Black bodies, to Indigenous bodies. The thing about this socialization is that some of us actually internalize these really negative tropes and will attach them. So these ideas of not being good enough, right? Not being qualified enough, not being smart enough, and just being a whole bunch of knots. And so really helping people understand, like, again, how does that show up in this really negative, broken record that can begin to go off in your head? And how do we begin to disrupt that? The other piece, and the last piece that I really help people try to understand as a result of racial violence is this avoidance of the avoidance of valued action or avoidance of valued living. And so what I mean is, once you've experienced the harm enough, we will begin to avoid experiencing that harm. So for example, if you take young children, young Black children, right? They love going to school just as much as any other group of children, right? But the research will tell you is that as early as 3-4 years old, Black children begin to understand that there is a greater value that is placed on white skin as opposed to that being placed on Black skin, and it's a differential treatment. And so you will find earlier on, because of racial trauma and because of racial violence, Black children don't see school as a place of safety, joy, and all those sorts of stuff. And so there'll begin to be an avoidance.
Right. Just like all of us want to avoid pain. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so these are the ways that I try to help people understand what it is, from a clinical perspective, and how does it show up in us, right? How does it show up in you? When I say some of these things, does any of that resonate with you? Well, yeah, actually. Yeah. It's not because there's something wrong with you. It's not because you're crazy. This is racial trauma. And these are the ways that it's showing up inside of you.
Yeah. And as soon as we can identify a cause of anything, any illness, any injury, any condition, we can start to deal with it. When we can't identify where it came from or what it is, it's just this pervasive sense of anxiety. And I know some of my friends that are part of the Black community also describe this sense of having to be perfect all the time, having to always be exceptionally polite because they feel that if they don't, they'll be judged, and so will everyone else in the community. And when I understood that burden, I really feel that it's a great way to burn out.
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
No.
Right. And so and so if we're having a conversation about psychological safety, how safe it is, for anybody to feel as though they have to be perfect. Right. And if you're not perfect, it's not just that you're not perfect, but that there will likely be a consequence levied on you that isn't levied on everybody else.
Right. Yeah. That's what my friends say, that they've been, they're afraid of being called an angry Black woman because that's a stereotype. And it's like everybody gets angry at times. That's just not fair to be labeled.
And so, and even in that, it's, as a white woman, right, you get to express emotion, right, in a way that you're not labeled the same way as a Black woman would.
Exactly.
Right. So sometimes it's not even angry. It's just it's an emotion, but it gets labeled as such. And so the other, it's just sort of from a cognitive perspective, like what we're talking about is hypervigilance, right? And so you can imagine, and so when the amygdala, what I mean, is engaged, this is the part of the brain that gets engaged around threats, right? And so again, racial trauma sort of gets born out of repeated, experiences of racial violence, right? Of racism, right? When the amygdala is engaged, right? You know, the part of the brain that is responsible for logic and thinking and reasoning and stuff like that is operating at a lower capacity.
Right. It takes extra effort.
Yeah. So imagine there's a group of people out here in the workplace who, because of the fear of racial violence, and because there's a lack of psychological safety, they're actually walking around all day, you know, for the better part of the day, where like their amygdala is engaged.
So Rohan, my concern is that an employer will listen to this and go, yeah, so we shouldn't hire people who may have had trauma because they're not going to operate as well. And the thing is that we understand now the extreme benefits and that come from having a diverse group of people in a workplace, different perspectives, the ability to attract different customers because you can think and produce things that are more creative. But let's look at it from the employer standpoint, not just racialized groups, but more and more we're understanding that with this pandemic, most people have had some level of trauma. Yeah. And so in healthcare organizations, saying they're trauma informed is pretty standard practice. But now all employers have to consider this. What would be your advice to supporting people who maybe experienced racialized trauma? How can we support them to be successful?
Yeah, so two things that I'll speak to this for employers. So I'll start at the micro, right? And so, you know, first thing is, you know, employers that have, a benefits program, right? An extended family benefits program or such, right? You know, like when we're thinking about who the provider is of some of those mental health services, like, are we ensuring that those services have racialized clinicians, right? And that folks can access them upon request, right? We need to think about those sorts of things. You know, as employers, you know, because, you know, our calendar, you know, we operate on a Judeo-Christian calendar, holidays, you know, observances and all those sorts of stuff. And for racialized folks, in order to take time off, or for folks who have a creed other than Christianity, right, then they're having to use vacation, right? And so, you know, do we have a policy in place that allows folks to access banked time that isn't their vacation time, right? The other piece, you know, that, and I think that this is, for me, is the biggest one, is what is the accountability mechanisms that we have in place when people actually do experience racial violence and want to come forward and report it? You know, what is the mechanism that organizations have in place that is clearly communicated across the organization? It's easy, it's accessible, that folks can report and know that it will be followed up with accordingly, right? That signals, you know, to staff that actually, you know, here's an organization that may actually care about, you know, my well-being, because it understands that this thing called racism is operating, and we're putting things in place to ensure that people are held accountable should it happen, when it happens, right? So, you know, organizations, you know, when I think about mental health and well-being, psychological safety, you know, so much of the focus is sort of on the individual, right? So we'll have a good benefits program. You know, they'll tell you, you know, make sure you get up and you take breaks from your computer. You know, we'll run classes on time management. We'll run classes on stress management. You know, and all of those things are fine and dandy. The issue is that it puts the onus on the individual for their own well-being or psychological safety. And the truth of the matter is, as we started at the top of this conversation, it's a systemic issue. It's a structural issue. So it requires a structural response, right? And so organizations have to put the structural pieces in place, right? So the example I just spoke about is, you know, around accountability when people are experiencing racial violence in the workplace, right? Experiencing trauma, harassment in the workplace, right? Number two is are taking a look at our demographics in our workplace, in our organization. You just mentioned that the research and the literature will show us that organizations that are more diverse, more reflective of the community in which they exist, do better. Right? That's just what it is, right? And so are we taking intentional approaches, tactics, strategies to make sure that our organization is reflective at all levels, right? Not just at entry level, right? Because I worked for an organization where there was not an equitable distribution of folks across the organization in various identities, and for Black identifying folks, there was the only part of the organization where they were overrepresented was in the lowest paid, least power, least responsibility roles. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the number that you have, but it's also how that distribution is throughout the organization. But our organization is taking an intentional approach. And so when we take these structural approaches, these are things that will help to enhance psychological safety in the workplace. Like if I walk into a workplace and I'm the only Black identified person in the workplace, I don't feel safe, right? But if I walk into a workplace and I see a whole bunch of folks, and it's not a hyper white workplace, that might suggest to me, oh, this is a safer place. They value equity. They value diversity. They value other bodies. They see non-white bodies as sources of knowledge and value. Oh, great.
Well, and I think this is true for customers, for clients, for investors, that everyone now is looking. I think there was a time when, as a white person, I never noticed. Yeah. And now any committee that I'm on, any meeting that I go to, I immediately notice if there is a lack of diversity. And because I'm old and I can do it, I will challenge them and say, why is it? And I have even said, when asked to be in a panel, I'm not going to be on this panel. I'll give up my seat if you could add diversity to it. Like, you don't need all these people that look the same, talk the same, think the same on this. You need to have differences of opinion and some diversity.
But Marianne, you say something there that I don't want to sort of let go, right? And so that role that you play, that action that you take, is so important. And literally what we need are more white folks to play that role, to be that disruptor, the white person who says to other white folks, hey, there's this room is full of us. This is not okay. Yeah. Right? And so if this thing is to really sort of, gain the traction that we needed to gain and to create the outcomes that we needed to get, we're actually it's going to require white folks like yourself saying things to other white folks, because it gets received differently.
Yeah. I do think, though, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I would have been terrified to speak up. And so that is one of the benefits. But I think the 20 and 30-year-olds today weren't trained to be blindly obedient. And so I know with my own children who are now in their 30s that they have no problem speaking up about things like that. And, so many white folks feel badly, but don't know what to do. And so I was one of those. And so I started to ask. Great. And the advice that I got was to speak up, but also to provide platforms, your platform, if it's bigger, to people that can speak up on behalf of those groups.
Absolutely. And so yes. And is that, when you mention the piece around being terrified, I want to acknowledge that feeling. Absolutely. Right. But what I would say to that is, as terrified as it is for somebody to speak up, imagine what it's like for the other.
Yeah. And I really have spent a lot of time imagining. And as you say, such a shame what happened to George Floyd. But I wonder, if he has any concept about the change that he's brought about. And we have this, to me, this window of opportunity. And because people are it's still fresh, and we need to take advantage of it to the best that we can.
Absolutely. So yeah, so around, the piece there around, how do we empower folks, right? And what does it mean for staff, or, what does it mean for organizations? I think for me, more of the onus is on organizations to really take a systemic approach to psychological safety, right? And that could be from hiring initiatives, that could be to accountability measures through when racism shows up in the work. It could be from to mandating check-ins, like manager and staff check-ins, right? Like, the amount of staff who I've spoken to, I've worked with, and it's like they don't have a relationship with their supervisor. It's only when something goes awry, right? They have no idea from a performance perspective how they're doing, right? Like, so it's all of these these structural pieces that I think the onus is on the organization. If they really want to be talk about or boast that they're doing work in this area, then that's sort of how it shows up, and really be committed to and articulate about their commitment to addressing structural racism and discrimination in the workplace.
Yeah, I think back to, half a century ago, where bosses really didn't know much about safety, and how now anybody who's a leader in certain industries has to have women's training on hazardous materials, has to know all of the protocols. And it's a more of a burden for them, because whatever their expertise is, they also have to add this. Well, it's the same thing. We have now identified the hazard of psychological risk, psychological harm, of racism, of exclusion. There's evidence for it. So leaders can no longer just say, well, I don't see color, or I treat everyone the same. Like, there's a higher duty of care now. And I think that those who want to be in leadership positions should be prepared for that, or they go to more tactical, strategic positions.
It should be required.
Right. Required. That's part of the job now. Is I know I've heard people get frustrated and say, well, everybody wants something. No, everybody wants to feel that who they are matters and the work that they do matters. And how we do that is going to be unique to each person, but it's not too much to ask, because the benefit to the organization of having every employee feel good about the work that they're doing is immense.
Yeah, and what I would say to that, what I would add to that comment, well, everybody wants something. Like, even if you were to sort of give space for that answer, it'd be like, okay, but in the world of finite resources, some decisions need to be made around how we prioritize how those resources get allocated. And so then how do we make decisions? Well, we turn to what our data tells us, right? And if our data is telling us, A, B, and C, well, then that's where we'll be dedicating our time, energy, and resources, right?
The challenge with that, Rohan, is when they say the majority of employees say this. And so the minority of employees, then the data doesn't support doing anything for them.
Oh, no, the data does tell us that even though, you can say, 80% of your employees say, things are going great, collecting some disaggregated data or differentiated data, of your racialized staff, 80% of those people will say that they're not feeling safe, right? So when we're also talking about disparity and disproportionality, right? So disproportionate to their representation in the space, there are these experiences that are happening, right? And so we're getting into the conversation of being data literate, right? And so absolutely, that's part of the requirement or the responsibility around creating psychological safety. If we're going to begin to use the data, you have to be data literate. Like anybody who says, well, 80% of our staff would say, I'm like, so what's this disaggregated breakdown of that, right? Like, like, you know what I mean? It's one of those disingenuous comments that, like, for a manager or a leader or a CAO to say that, it's just like no, like, somebody who did stats 101 would just debunk that, right? So but this is why we should lean on the data, right, to really inform, and whether that be, and there are all different forms of data, but we should be leaning on the data to make choices around actions and the allocation of resources.
Mm-hmm. In psychological safety, I think the majority of actions are free because it's how we treat each other. It's not a big investment in workshops or training or retreats, or it's not new equipment. It's just saying, this is the way we're going to treat people in our workplace. But
and to hold people accountable who aren't operating that way.
There's the thing. How do you hold the star performer or, that long-term leader accountable when all they do is justify and defend their actions? So
this conversation about accountability is an interesting one, right? And so I'll go back to I'll use an example of my time at the school board, right? Just to sort of demonstrate that we do have the ability to hold people accountable. It's just around who we hold accountable, and who we choose to hold accountable and who we choose not to hold accountable, right? And so, at this one particular school board that I was with, they looked at suspension and expulsion data, right? And the suspension and expulsion data showed that disproportionately Black and Indigenous students were being expelled far greater than the rate in the board, right? And so somebody would look at that and be like, well, those students are just problematic. Well, of course, right? Then you start looking at the reasons that these children were being suspended. These people were being suspended for wearing sweaters with a hoodie, wearing big earrings, wearing do-rags, right? There's like a category, there's a category that you can tick off that's basically, principal discretion, right? So there's no real answer, right? So what that tells you is that they have no problem holding certain bodies accountable, right? And what we also saw is that on the inverse is that other groups were not being suspended or expelled at a rate proportionate to their rate in the student population, right? So we're not holding folks accountable. We're making choices, right? And so inside organizations, and it's based off of value, right? What are the values of that organization? Who does that organization value, right? So when we're like, oh, such and such is the top performer, but, we have 5 complaints of harassment against this person. That person, who's in charge of the organization and everybody else who knows that, right? They're all complicit. Right. And so, sometimes when they talk about there are, a couple of things is you can't be no innocent bystanders, yes. Right? It's either you're a racist or you're anti-racist. Right? Like you can't sort of sit on the sidelines and sort of be like, well, it's not me, right? Well, this person is doing it, but it's not me. Yeah, but if you have the power to do something about stopping that person, then if you don't, you're now just equally responsible, right? So this piece around being complicit, people really need to wrap their heads around it. Are you willing to? So here's the thing that I like to talk about, at my workplace, right? When things are going awry, like significantly around staff performance, right? Or people being in violation of some very significant policies. I'm like, 3 questions you better have a good answer to. What did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? You better have good answers to those questions.
Yeah. We were doing interviews around inclusion across the country, and Dana is a psychologist in Nova Scotia, and she talked about being explicit, creating a shared purpose. So we could create a shared purpose around inclusion. And those questions, the idea that you're either contributing to the shared purpose or you're taking away from it. And how do we know? Well, we know that when we see something, we say something. We know that we do it immediately. We know that we are going to intervene, and we know how we're going to do it, because we could be wrong, right? We could misinterpret a behavior. Maybe it's offensive to us. It's not to the person that we think might be, but still that everybody knows we're doing it for the collective good. So it's that being explicit and not waiting for people to figure it out for themselves.
Absolutely. Would concur. And once you're explicit and you have sort of put the tools in place and you've put the resources in place, and you've done the capacity building, you've done the training, you've done the policy bits, now what?
Now you have to hold each other accountable.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's sort of what that's what it comes back down to. And so there is a reluctance, right? Because there's also a price to pay for this, right? So I think we should also sort of be really honest in the conversation. And what I mean is, there is significant resistance, and we see it, right? We see a mobilization of white supremacists, groups, whether they're on social media or whether they're organizing politically or anything as such, who stand in the face of wanting to move equity forward. And those who want to be equity practitioners, those who want to be anti-oppression practitioners, organizations and leaders who want to be on the forefront of this, they also experience not only resistance, but violence from groups who are opposed to this work in a really significant way, right? And so I think it's really important that we also acknowledge that, because it comes with risk. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but not everybody is holding hands and singing Kumbaya, right? There are groups that will organize, to interrupt that necessary work that needs to happen. And we see it happening all over the place, right? There's a number of practitioners that I know and that I work with, whether, they're independent consultants or whether they are doing this work inside organizations, and, they are threatened, right? They are ridiculed on social media. People have death threats levied against them. Right. And so there's a level of seriousness that comes with wanting to be on the right side of these issues. And so so when we talk about sort of some of the fear and stuff that come into, wanting to be on the right side of the issue or wanting to be on the right side of history or pushing, part of it is coming from a threat of violence. Right? And so I think it's really important to say that.
Yeah, it's something, Rohan, that I've thought about a lot, is both how can you have that much hate in your heart? Like what happened to you that you are so hateful? But also, what would it be like for me to walk down the street knowing that somebody could want to harm me? And I don't know who it is. I can't always tell by looking at them. And it's terrifying. Like just to even consider it. And I think this is something that a lot of people miss in the conversation, is that it is more than oh, you get equal pay for equal work, or we don't see color or whatever. There's so much more complexity to the issue. And that's why if workplaces can be very clear on their values, and that people who feel that hate just don't come to those organizations, that, don't get a job here because this is not who we are. But if they want to just say, well, we don't really have a problem, we don't want to talk about it, then it still stays below that polite courtesy that's not real.
Right. Yeah. Or we chalk it up to communication issues, or it's bullying in the workplace, or just the same. It's taking away from psychological safety, and so we have to respond accordingly, because the implicit message that we're sending by not responding accordingly and not putting the appropriate pieces in place is that we're really not that interested in your safety.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that you're making me think about is that when we talk about accountability, it really needs to be that they record every complaint, record who it was against, who made it, and what happened, even if it was nothing. Even if they dismissed it, even if they said it's not serious, that they record every single one of those to be able to look at the data and see real data on what's going on.
Do we see a pattern?
Yeah.
Do we see trends? And even to take it one step further is, are we then reporting that data? Are we sharing that data with the organization in aggregate form, of course, right? But are we saying to the organization, in 2020, you know what I mean? Under our harassment and violence in the workplace policy, here are the number of complaints that we had. And of those complaints, here's how many were investigated.
We're just looking at updating a resource that we have. And one of the answers used to be, didn't answer, whatever. And now we say, prefer not to answer. And our advice to the employer is, if people are preferring not to answer, your question has to be, why do they not feel safe to answer that question?
Absolutely. And so, when you sort of started on this piece just around accountability and the importance of it, it is the piece that organizations, come up short with the most. The one thing that kind of holds this whole thing together, right, what gives it a chance, right, is the one thing that organizations come up short the most, and that's accountability.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true with all workplace issues, but this one is significantly so.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of time, and I knew that you were going to have a lot to offer, Rohan, and you haven't disappointed at all. I mean, this is a tough topic, and I know it's going to be tough for some people to listen to and to see themselves and to understand that they have to do better. Yeah. But I also wanted to ask you, if you were to describe a workplace that was psychologically safe, psychologically healthy for everyone, that is free of racism, how would you describe it to somebody who doesn't know what psych health and safety is?
Yeah, good question. I don't even know if I feel like I'm allowed to imagine what that place would
Yes,
look
please
like.
do. Please imagine.
Yeah, so I think one of the first things that, people would feel as though that they could come to work and sort of be themselves in all representations of it, and not fear of any sort of retaliation or punishment or anything along those lines, right? And so, if I want to come in my cultural garb, that's fine. You know what I mean? If I want to come in my afro, that's fine. If I want to come with locks, that's fine. If I want to come with a shaved head, that's fine. That you can just sort of bring your whole self to work, and it's not going to work against you, right? When I think about psychological, like a place that, would be psychologically safe, I think about that. I would be naive to think that, discrimination and oppression just vanishes, right? But I'd want to know that I work in an organization that acknowledges that it's a thing and has put the bits in place so that I feel as though it knows how to respond appropriately when it shows up, right? I would feel safer in a place that doesn't say we're striving to eliminate all of it. However, we know it exists. And so here's what we have in place to take care of it when it does. I would feel safer in that sort of place. I'd feel safer in a place where I actually see myself in all aspects of the organization, right? Decision-making, marketing, promotion, all of those sorts of stuff where I see myself in all levels or all aspects of that organization. So those are some of the bits for me, around psychological safety, I think starts to create an ideal. Right?
Okay, so you can describe it, therefore we can manifest it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Yeah.
So any last words that you want to share, Rohan?
Yeah, I think that a couple last words was that, just a couple of takeaways I hope for your listeners is one is it's, whether or if we're labeling it psychological safety, oppression, racial discrimination, anti-Blackness, it's a systemic issue and it requires a systemic response. Plain and simple, right? We have to acknowledge, we need to measure, we need to implement, we need to evaluate, right? We need to do those things. We need to follow the data, be data literate, right? But we need to follow the data, right? And act appropriately. And the last thing is accountability. That's the secret sauce, right?
Yeah, and that's my biggest takeaway from today is to improve the way we talk about accountability and to make it more than just a word, but an actual process that people can follow. Yeah. Rohan, if somebody wanted your help as a consultant on any of these issues or wanted to come to you for counseling, how do they get in touch with you?
You can get in touch with me. The email address is rohan@thebreakthrough.ca. That would be the best way to get a hold of me. You want to know what was really funny, Marianne, is I just need to make sure that I've actually, because I never email myself.
To make sure that you've got it right.
Yeah. rohan@thebreakthrough.ca.
Yeah, and Rohan is ROHAN.
Yeah, correct. Or folks can always Google the website. So if you Google breakthrough counseling, that I'll come up and people can get a hold of me through the website.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And for people who are listening, subscribe to the podcast, and then you'll find out when this one and all the others get released. And thank you so much, Rohan, for your time today. That was a great conversation and very inspiring for me.
Marianne, I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.